Good morning, everybody. Let's see. If you don't know me, my name is John Solano. I'm a family counselor, and I've been for the last decade. I've also been a professional counselor for over 30 years and have worn many, many hats. Um, I kind of cutting to the chase today because this may be a bit of a long video. Uh, is that through my counseling career, I've provided services um, to single parents, to single dads, to single moms. I've run men's groups. I've run co-ed groups. Um, I used to provide free counseling for a place called the Single Mother Support Network. So I've spent my share of time on both sides of the line when it comes to issues that men and women go through, marital issues, divorce and child custody issues, etc. Um, But there's been something on my mind for a long time that relates to the issue of, I guess you could say, uh, domestic violence, um, and just I guess, the world we live in terms of the abuse that we experience as human beings, the abuse, the tragedies, etc. But more specific to the issue of, I guess you could say, of domestic violence. And again, research I've seen on both sides of the line with respect to, female victims of domestic violence and male victims of domestic violence. And and so, of course, one of the things I'm thinking about is what's the connection between having been abused and uh, having been become the abuser, the victimizer kind of idea. I think there's an elephant in the living room that we just don't want to talk about because it's politically incorrect, and it has been for some time, because the focus has really been on men as perpetrators, the men as perpetrators. And for a long, long time, I mean, most of my career, again, over 30 years as a professional counselor, I've seen society try to resolve that issue. It's like, that men are the problem, that men are the primary perpetrators, so we need to do something about this. But as far as I can tell, there hasn't been a lot of headway. There hasn't been a lot of resolution. There hasn't been any real movement, because look at where we're at today. I mean, there are all sorts of, initiatives and things, about trying to eradicate uh, domestic violence and abuse, but mostly it's really focused on the women who are the victims, and again, men the victimizers. And let me just say something really quick, and I hope this makes some sense as I kind of go through some things here. But one of the things I thought a long time ago, first of all, there's not a lot of research that goes into why men do what they do. It's just kind of like an accepted, you know, life fact that men are the perpetrators, women are the victims. The best we can do is to try to, increase jail time and really put a ton of money in supporting the victim, but we don't really look at why the phenomena is happening. And not only as men as the perpetrators, but also women as perpetrators. Um, and of course, I've spent, again, the majority of my life as a counselor, really looking at why people do what they do, and especially the impact of trauma on people, and what happens to people when they become traumatized, hence the need for recovery and healing and all this kind of stuff. But one of the things that I just kind of go common sense, it's like, um, don't kick the Rottweiler. That's my idea. Don't kick the Rottweiler. It's interesting because when we look at big dogs. Sometimes we call men, those are the big dog. Here comes the big dog, the big dogs, here come the big dogs. And it's like, you know, there's something about that metaphor, because we seem to know as a common sense idea that the big dogs are important in life. The big dogs are great companions. The big dogs can do are work dogs. The big dogs are protectors. And so the big dogs have a lot of great qualities to them. But if they are raised by somebody abusive, then those dogs can become either one, very anxious and passive, or two, very angry and very vicious. And we know, like people will say, well, if you want to create a mean guard dog, you got to make them that way, and because it's not in their nature oftentimes. I mean, certainly with dogs and even human beings, we have a nature, and that needs to be reckoned with. So we train dogs and we discipline children. Human beings need discipline and training as well because of our animal nature. But just to say, one of the psychological facts seems to be, even when with animals, is that if you abuse an animal, then you distort that animal's perception of, oh, I got a big old tractor going by here. Um, you distort that animal's perception not only of the world and who its friend is and who isn't, but of its purpose. And things go really sideways. And so you really have to be careful around the dog that's been abused. People know that when they adopt, or rescue animals that have been abused or that have been released into the wild, wild animals, right? We need to be careful of. But that's the idea. Don't kick the big dog. Don't kick the Rottweiler, because if you do, he's either going to leave, run away, he's going to become worthless because he's going to be so anxious and withdrawn, or he's going to bite you. He's going to get you. And I think that this is what society doesn't want to talk about: how we raise our boys, how we raise our men. I know, yes, there has been research into this. There have been a number of people like Warren Farrell and Sam Keane and Robert Bly and John Lee and many, many others who have spoken on the issue, but it just seems to be the hot potato that gets dropped. In the meantime, people are getting hurt. Men are going to prison, women are going to hospitals, men are going to hospitals too. It's like nobody wants to connect the two dots and maintain the connection, right? um, so I'm also going to speak to this from my own perspective, having been on the planet for 60 years. And so I was born in 1961. um, and have certainly, this can observations are rooted even farther back into our history and culture around how we treat men. But just a couple of historical pieces, and I'll jump in and out of this because I actually wrote down over, I think, 20 different pieces that I think contribute to this idea that we're kicking the Rottweiler here, we're kicking the big dog, and we got to stop doing that. So first of all, you know, let's talk about just kind of historically, just kind of the expectations of war and death. Like it's always been expected, you know, that men are the ones who go to war. Like even today, it's probably 95% of the people in the military are men, and probably 99% of the personnel on the front lines in combat are men. And it's only been a recent phenomenon in the United States. I know in places like Israel, that women have been involved in combat for a long time, but certainly not to the proportion that men are. But just to say more or less, like in kind of North America, this has been the phenomenon: is that it has been men going to war, and the expectation that you will go to war. So when I was a young man, the Vietnam War was just getting started. And throughout my entire life, I remember preparing for war. And part of that preparation, of course, was to deny your feelings, to know that at some point you were either going to die or you were going to kill somebody else. And there was a draft. So I grew up in the United States. So you were going to be drafted. You knew that. And there was, two world wars prior to that in Korea. And it was just part of our duty as men to be willing to sacrifice our lives. Now, as a young man, I remember saying to myself, why do I have to sacrifice my life? Why is it that my sister and my mother don't have to go to war? My dad was a World War II veteran. Now, the answers to those questions had to come to me later, but I'm just saying, as a young man and looking at history, and all the graphic footage that we saw from our history in war to protect our country, and to protect freedom, it was almost 100% men who sacrificed their lives, um, and there was just an expectation, you know. And not just that. I mean, you look at the entire life. I mean, it's kind of, whether it's a burning building, whether it's somebody drowning, whether it's a car accident, whether whatever it is, it seems like, again, you look at emergency responders, most of them are men. Yes, there are a few women out there, and historically, it's been men almost 100%. And it's nice to see women actually engaged in those activities, but it's still a small fraction. That even when it comes to daily life and family life, it would, it's the man who somehow bears the responsibility and being willing to sacrifice his life. The message that sends to young boys, and the message that it sent to me as a young boy, was one of, I must not be as valuable as everybody else. I must not be as valuable as my sister or my mother. I must not be as valuable as women. Why am I expendable? Why do I have to die? I mean, those are very accurate observations and very true feelings that need to be responded to in society, because if they're not responded to in a positive way, then that's what you're left with. Why me? What does this mean about me when, I have to be willing to die and to sacrifice my life at the drop of a hat, when women don't have to? That's not expected of them. All right. Um, so, another one, just to kind of to move away from that a little bit, is kind of the false idea that women are allowed, and I say false idea because it's just not a good idea. It's a terrible idea that women are allowed to hit men, but men aren't allowed to hit women. Right? We grew up with that historically, especially, back in the day. You even saw it on TV quite often, in fact, where a couple would be arguing or whatever, and the woman would get upset and she would slap the man, and of course the man is expected to just kind of not feel anything. It's like to just laugh it off, and to just stand there and take it. Or you see women getting hysterical or whatever, and pounding on a man's chest or slapping a man repeatedly, and the man just, best he can do is just try to restrain her, um, but then act like nothing happened, act like it was completely okay. And then in some of these instances, what you see is when these couples are going at each other, though, it's almost like the woman is allowed to vent on the man in a physical way, pounding his chest, slapping him, and then later embrace as if it's okay and that behavior is excused. I mean, come on, folks. Like, don't you agree that's completely wrong? I remember one time, I don't know, I was in an argument with someone I was going out with when I was probably 17 or 18, and this woman slapped me. This young woman slapped me. And, first of all, I had like a zero tolerance, uh, for that, because even though, I mean, my dad was a World War II vet and he was very tough, but he never hit us, and my mom never hit me either. And so, as far as I was concerned, I'll be damned if somebody is going to put hands on me, lay hand on me when my own parents haven't even done that. But this young lady apparently, absorbed the cultural norms and maybe saw it in her own family. I don't know, but she thought it would be okay to slap me. And I said to her, I'm not sure how you think that that's okay. I mean, I can feel that. I can feel it just as much as you would feel that. So I don't know why you would think that that's okay with you. And that was the end of that relationship. Done. Right? But this crazy historic thing, about how it's allowable, it's even encouraged, or for a woman to kick the Rottweiler, right? Repeatedly kick the Rottweiler, and then expect that big dog to just sit there and take it and continue to be a good dog and continue to be a good worker and a good protector, etc. It's like that just makes no sense whatsoever. Like I said, a really crazy false idea. um, and it still exists today. You know, um, I hope less than it did historically. I think because there's so much emphasis right now on physical assault, things like that, and we're starting to gain greater awareness around domestic violence, and that women are also physically aggressive, and that that should not be allowed. That's starting to become a little more visible, but still far far from being the eradicated. It should never be okay for either person to hit the other person. um, so I want to just add to that, I guess you could say, because of the heightened, I guess, heightened information, knowledge, awareness that we have in a number of different areas. But me coming from the area of psychology and human development and working with families, I understand the importance of attachment and bonding, and what what abuse does to that attachment and bonding. We call it disrupted attachment. It disrupts the attachment. Um, but what we also know, say for instance, is that when it comes to child abuse, let's say domestic violence, and there's one person is abusing their partner, and there's children who witness it, is that is that when a child witnesses one of their caretakers being abused, they are more terrorized from that, witnessing it, than if it would have happened to them directly. And that's because of our deep need for attachment. We attach to people because we need to survive, and that is, putting it mildly. It's we need to survive, we need to live, and the source of our life is our attachment to people. And so if the source of our life is attacked in any way, it terrorizes us more than actually being attacked ourselves. That being said, also is that there's a misnomer here, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. There's some truth to that, but also when we look at abuse in families, and relational abuse, and I'm just talking relationships in general. When people abuse each other, words that are used or words that are not used, like when somebody doesn't get praise and recognition, or when somebody is told that they're terrible and that they're a loser or whatever, that they're physically yelled or verbally yelled at and abused, that can leave a greater mark than even physical abuse. But we live in a time right now where it's like people are very verbally abusive towards each other, and sometimes you know that verbal abuse is actually, I guess you could say, you know is even more prevalent with women towards men or women towards women. Now, some research would say that women develop a greater vocabulary much earlier than men do. So that means that it could mean that if women develop greater skill verbally, that skill can be used as a weapon. And I think women do learn very early in life how to weaponize their language, how to, how to attack people verbally. Um, and yeah, I mean, you even hear women speak about this amongst themselves. They call it being catty. And a lot of the assaulting comes verbally from women, but the impact of the verbal assault is is damaging to people. And so when we're looking at, you know kind of even legally, and it gets tricky, right? Because we have free speech and all this kind of stuff in terms of what we can say. But I guess the best society has been able to come up with so far is um, legislation around hate speech, where there's certain words, or inciting a riot or inciting violence. So yes, certainly the law pays attention to the words one speaks, but it's very, very limited, because that, of course, is challenged by the for free speech. But it's something that we really need to keep an eye on, especially in a more, I guess you could say, sophisticated society. Um, One of the things that we would say, for instance, like the use of sarcasm, or that people can speak in a way that's passive aggressive, In other words, people use language and the tone of the language and where that speech is coming from. They use it purposely to insult and to attack other people, but it's passive aggressive. What I would say about that is that that's more dishonorable than two people having a physical altercation in a certain way, because at least physically, you can, it's above board, it's honest. But when somebody's being sarcastic or, attacking at a physical level, belittling and nagging and, you know, uh, doing those things, it just erodes the soul of a person, and it's a terrible, offensive experience. It's an attack, and it just seems like it's just more honest to call that out. I mean, if somebody were being passive aggressive, and and I was working with them as a counselor, I would help this person come to see that they're angry, and be honest about the anger, and be honest about the attack that they've launched on other people, and consequently, why they're being attacked back verbally, or why they're being ignored, or why their relationship is falling apart. So I'd have to call BS on that. I'd have to help this person see that what they're doing is actually a full-on attack. But, sure, most of us as counselors are pretty good at being able to call that out, but in the rest of society, unfortunately, it is not allowed, or it is allowed, um, even if people recognize it in public or at a gut level. It's still a very hard thing to fight. Um, and so this is a big difference between men and women. Again, it's like yelling at the big dog, screaming at the big dog, criticizing the big dog. That's all assault. That's all assault. Let's just not even try to cover that up. That's assaultive. All right. um, again, along with that is the false idea, again, a bad idea to go with that, that that only men are abusers and perpetrators, and women are somehow squeaky clean. Women somehow got this uh, blessing from God or whatever to be exempt from being an abuser or perpetrator. That's just not even true at all. We just abuse and perpetrate in different ways. Um, that research is pretty clear around that as well. But just, again, you got to think about kicking the Rottweiler, because when, as a man, as a boy, when you're coming into this world and you're being constantly told that just by the very nature of who you are, you're an abuser or perpetrator. Again, that is degrading. Um, it's a direct attack on one's value, for no other reason other than you happen to get a particular chromosome, and you happen to come onto the planet, and all of a sudden you're getting attacked and labeled. Um, it's just wrong. Um, so that when men kind of assert themselves, oftentimes, um, and become strong and passionate in who they are, they're often seen or labeled as abusive. And I know this is tough these days, especially these days. But as I said, my dad was a World War II vet, very tough guy, a very gruff guy, and he often spoke very loudly, a man of few words, but when he did speak, wow, he spoke loudly. And I remember, that was scary. And I made the mistake of saying, my dad was, that wasn't right, Dad. That wasn't right, that you needed to be that way. Actually, that wasn't true. Like I said, my dad never laid a hand on us, but he would get passionate about things. And any man, any person needs to have passion. And he wasn't being aggressive. He wasn't being abusive. He was being assertive. He was being big. He's the big dog. He was the big dog. He was being a big dog, and that's, big dogs bark loud. And so there's a way you know that we need to just appreciate that, and not try to squelch it, again, because it's a soul killer. It really is a soul killer to men. Um, so here's one. It's about language. This is just a couple of things that I've noticed, but you know people, people call people a dick, right? Or dickhead. What is that meant to be? It means to, you're being a dick. Well, what does that mean? It's kind of like right there with asshole. It kind of means, you're just being ridiculous or whatever. So you got the ridiculous in there, um, but to call somebody a dick or a dickhead, um, it means you're stupid. It means you're belligerent. It means all these kinds of things. But we 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 call people that by referencing the male sexual anatomy. Again, that's degrading when you know uh, refer to a person's body, period, but sexual anatomy is a way to explain errant behavior or what have you. But you grow up with hearing things like that. um, it just kind of, again, a direct hit in the gonads with that one. um, that being said, there's been a lot of research in the last probably 20 years around circumcision. And I want to say this briefly because, uh, the for sometimes religious, sometimes cultural, and it used to be there was believed health benefits from circumcising young men. Um, but I think over the last probably 50 years that the research around that and the cultural and religious kinds of implications around that have really diminished to the point of where there's no real psychological value, in that procedure. All that being said, think about it. If you were an infant coming to the planet, just arriving to the planet, and one of the first things that happened is a direct assault upon your genitals, how do you think that would leave you feeling? Now, that being said, when we're young, we don't have the ability to kind of like our ability to explicitly remember things isn't intact, that part of our brain. But implicit memory is. In other words, when we're young, because we don't have the ability to kind of explain why things are the way they are, in any detail, we're mostly sensory animals. We get a sense, you would get a sense of how friendly the world is by how people treat you. And how would you know that? Because of your five senses would be processing information, gathering and processing information for you. So when we're young, we get to know how whether the world is a friendly place or not through our five senses. Well, if all of a sudden, you come to the planet and you're punched in the gut and kicked in the head, what sense do you think that that's going to leave you with? Is this a friendly planet? Are people friendly or aren't they? I think that's a very significant wound that we deliver to young men when they come to the planet, if they're circumcised, right? So I would, and medically speaking, we know that it's not necessary. We know that, what uncircumcised men experience greater pleasure in sex, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no reason to be doing that. But I just think it's just common sense at a psychological level. The last thing you want to do to any human being when they come to the planet and they're here for hours or days or what have you is to subject them to intense pain in the genital area. That leaves its mark, not only, kind of literally, but it psychologically, it does something I don't think we even have come, or we're not even close to appreciating how deeply that could impact the psyche in terms of how a man moves forward in life and in terms of how his aggression is channeled. All right. Um, but speaking of the genitals, here's another terrible idea that has been just perpetrated over and over again. And that is that, you've heard it said that, the only thing men want is sex. The only thing men want is sex. You've heard that said how many times? And of course, research, says, okay, well, men think about sex way more often than women do, but women think about sex too. Women think about sex too, which leads me to, this next kind of piece is that you grow up, like somehow this idea continues forward in life, and then it's crippling to both people. So now you have, you know, women who do have a libido, who do have a sexual desire, but they have to repress it, because if they start to experience and express their sexuality in a way that's healthy, then all of a sudden they become like men, and men are the bad guys, men and their sexuality, because all men want is sex. So now if a woman wants sex, she has to repress that feeling. Or if she does have sex, she has to kind of make excuses for it, like, oh, I had too much to drink, oh, I was lonely, or oh, I just wanted to connect emotionally. Those are all cover-ups. Those are all basically cover-ups for the fact that a woman does have a libido, and she does have sexual desire, and she does want to have sex. But because of this, the way this cultural norm has been set up, it has kind of unjustly, unfortunately, placed women in this kind of holier than thou place, and it also has placed men in this, this kind of seedy, all men want is sex. Now, this could be unpackaged a little bit further. Research shows, for instance, that the level of oxytocin that flows through a person's body and that is released in different experiences is higher with women than with men. Oxytocin is that chemical that gives you the warm, fuzzy feeling, the closeness feeling, the intimacy feeling. It's the feeling that we get when we hug somebody. It's the feeling when we get a warm smile from our child. It's the feeling when, of course, in a romantic relationship, that you're in an embrace, that you're kissing, you might be making love, especially where your body's just being flooded with oxytocin. And I mean, that's a great thing, right? Because if you're involved in lovemaking, with your partner, then you do want to feel close. I mean, that oxytocin is kind of like the glue that gets introduced into a relationship, and consequently, that's why you shouldn't be messing with it. It should really be something to be experienced within committed relationships at the sexual level, because it is like a glue. It is like a glue. It's meant to glue people together. Um, and so that's why, for instance, pornography is so dangerous. Or that's why basically narcissism is so dangerous, because you end up falling in love with yourself, or falling in love, if you will. And I would say falling in love, but the oxytocin is released in your brain and in your body, in relation to what you happen to be with. And so if somebody's watching porn, then that's kind of be what they get attached to. That's what they get glued to. If you're, a woman watching porn, or if you're a woman, uh, reading or watching what people call soft porn, like romance novels, or if you're watching TV, like if you're watching The Bachelor or Bachelorette, or any of these TV shows that are, are set up to create these really romantic, exciting, adventurous things, you can find yourself, getting flooded with oxytocin by watching these TV shows. And so pretty soon you're more interested in watching the TV show than you are in making love with your partner. You're more interested, obviously, in the porn than you are, actually having the real deal with your partner. A lot of these TV shows and reality shows, like The Bachelor, Bachelorette, Bachelor in Paradise, and other things, they're basically, a form of soft porn. When you're watching people, engaging with each other on these, again, these very, tropical places or what have you, in romantic locations, and they're physically, being sexual with each other, or psychologically and emotionally, being sexual with one another. It's like that is a very seductive thing. So, um, yeah, just this whole notion that, all men want is sex, is just way off, and consequently women aren't interested in sex. And now these days you get to see, um, kind of like, I don't know what you want to call indulgent ends, on both of those spectrums. um, so I'm gonna get into that a little bit later. um, so let's see. So I just mentioned, yeah, that, I mean, this is, like I said, it's a sad dynamic to be in around this sexuality where, kind of women have been thrown into this role of being the kind of the sexual moral gatekeepers. And we know that that isn't true. I guess along with that too is the bad idea that men are more likely to engage in infidelity than women are. And as far as I can tell, generally speaking, if we were to talk about heterosexual infidelity, whenever a man is being involved in an affair, he's usually involved with a woman. And so if a woman's involved in the affair, whether she's married or unmarried, that's a dishonorable act. So so that number has to actually be equal, right? I mean, a man can't be in an affair by himself. So if he's in an affair with a woman, then that also means that there are equal amounts of women involved in the affair than there are men, or same as men, right? So there's just equal amounts. But we're being told that no, men are primarily the if you will, the perpetrators of infidelity, and that isn't true. Again, women have libidos as well. They have sex drives. Women are fall prey to seduction just as men fall prey to seduction. There's been some research to say that men and women uh, go into affairs for different reasons. Both of them could try to claim some, what do you want to call it, redemption, by saying, well, if a man goes into an affair, well, of course, if all he wants is sex, it's no big deal. It's not an emotional thing. Then what's the big deal? It's just physical. It's not emotional. On the other hand, a woman can say, well, the reason I got into the affair because I was lonely. It was totally emotional. It wasn't really physical. All I wanted was the emotional connection. And so both of those positions try to claim redemption, but they're both dishonorable, and they're both hiding places. I would say the woman is in a hiding place there psychologically. Yes, she does have physical needs. She does have a libido. She does have sexual desire, and she wants to have those needs met. But she can't just go out and say it, because if she did that, then she would be just like the guys are, and the guys are bad guys. So she can't do that. So she's got to hide it behind some sort of rationale, and that's called rationalization, of course. The men on the other side are actually probably seeking more of an emotional connection, but they don't know how to go about it because throughout their entire lives, they've been trained away from their emotions. And so the only way a man can experience that level of kind of emotion and closeness is through the sexual act. Again, talking about how men and women have different levels of oxytocin in their bloodstreams, and how a man's level of oxytocin is lower. So a man would get more a feeling of closeness more from engagement in a physicality of something. Although men are trained away from being physical, if you will, other than the sexual act. So anyway, again, more could be said. Um, you know, Feminism had, these days when we talk about feminism, it's a bigger conversation. Back in the 60s and the 70s, when I was growing up, there was only one feminism. Now there's, I guess you could say, many types of feminism, and even feminists who, um, if you will, went through the movement in the 60s and 70s will say that the feminism of today is not what they fought for back in the 60s and 70s. But just to say that a facet of, I want to call toxic femininity or feminism, um, is this idea that men are the problem. That this kind of radical fringe or somewhere there mixed in the feminist ideology was a couple of things. One, men are the problem. Just generally speaking, because you got a particular chromosome and you're a man, you're the problem. You're the problem sexually. You're the problem when it comes to domestic violence. You're the problem to economic problems. You're the problem to war. You're the problem. So men were just seen as the problem. The response to that, by, I think, fair to say, by feminism, was that men needed to become more like women, emotionally, intellectually, and even physically. Really, even physically. Back in the 70s, that's kind of when men started to shave all their facial hair, when they started to shave the hair off their bodies, when they, start to go to salons and get their nails done and pedicures and all this kind of stuff. That was usually kind of what women did. And I'm not saying especially because men do need to take care of themselves, but the direction for that came from feminism and came loud and oftentimes belligerently based upon this: men are the problem, men are the threat to society, you need to become more like women. So that movement, permeated society, and pretty soon from a lot of different directions, men were just told that they were wrong. Again, you're the problem, men, you're wrong, but you can be fixed as long as you become more like women. Um, and Yeah, so that just kind of sends the message to a man from day one that who you are, if you will, the way God made you, is wrong. God made a huge mistake, and somehow now women are the ones that need to tell you how to be a man. Women, needed to tell you how to dress and how to speak and how to emote and how to conduct yourself behaviorally. And so, that just became, I guess you could say, a very, very dominant phenomena, but very soul killing to a man. Again, to come to the planet and immediately hear that you have no value, um, other than, but we can reshape you. We can reshape you into the image of a woman. Um, and maybe then you have value, but at the same time you're a man, and then have to live with the idea that who you are at your core, has somehow been labeled as wrong. Let's just get back to, this is seriously kicking the Rottweiler from day one. Beat up the Rottweiler, beat up the big dog from day one. Try to reshape him into being, uh, a little tiny toy dog or something. It just is wrong. Um, so yeah, let me just turn my. I told you this might be a long video, right? Um, and then along with that, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you saw more and more TV shows coming out that showed men as buffoons. Okay, by this time, like maybe feminism and now having been in society, men are the problem. We tried to make them like women. Uh, that's been a longer process than we thought, but now we can at least, you know, emasculate them. We can kind of keep them pinned down psychologically by painting them out as buffoons, by the Archie Bunkers, by the, you know, uh, you know, what's his name, Bundy and his family, you know, Sanford and Son, you name it. The men were being painted out as buffoons, and then you see Family Guy, and then you see King of the Hill, and then you see American Dad, and these shows that just again paint dads out as that best breadwinners, um, but ultimately, um, undisciplined, silly. You put up with them, you tolerate them. All right. So again, now as young men growing up, you see your dads being attacked. You see again what you're going to become at some point, a man, and you have to kind of bear the burden of being all the ills of society, and then kind of being made the ass end of jokes for the entire time. Um, you know that generally, here's another idea that's bad, that generally men are shamed for weakness. Check this out here. That men are shamed for weakness by both men and women, by both men and women. And this is again the confusing thing. It's that you've got a number 30, 40 years since the 60s, feminism came in and said, well, men, you need to be more like women. Okay, well, if I'm going to be more like women, I guess then I can show more of my weakness. Oh no, heavens no. Nope, you're still expected to be tough. You're still expected to sacrifice your life. You're still expected to, um, bring home the bacon, if you will. You're just not allowed to be weak. if you will, or vulnerable. And that whole term weakness, you know, you're not allowed to be weak. You're not allowed to be meek. You're not allowed to, you know, to let your guard down, you know. And so this has been a very, very confusing message for men. On the one hand, you know, be vulnerable, you know, be willing to share your weaknesses, you know, physically and emotionally, and seek out help, et cetera. Well, at the same time, you see on, especially through social media and other media, that, you know, that women prefer men who take charge. Women prefer men. And you know, of course, women will say, oh no, that's not true. No, that's absolutely true still, very much so. um, so let's see what else. There's no, you know, historically speaking, you know, when men and women were selecting partners and choosing lifestyles, you know, a woman kind of had, I guess you could say, three options. She could work, she could uh, have a child and stay home, or she could just basically stay home and not work. So women had three options when they were looking at a lifestyle for themselves, whereas men had one option and still have one option: work. You know, it's just because nobody's going to take care of you. But women seem to have this option of, you know, you know, looking for a man who will take care of them. You know, if a man were to look for a woman to take care of him, people would frown upon that. People would look at him as like, what's your problem? You're not really being a man. But if a woman were to look for a man to take care of her, there would be no problems with that. And they would say, oh, yeah, you know, sure, you can stay at home. Maybe somebody will take care of you. You know, most of the women I talk to, um, you know, actually have suggested that they prefer that. Even working women that I've talked to talk about how exhausted they are and how they wish that they didn't have to work. Now, I'm guessing that's probably a small percentage of women, but I don't ever hear a man saying that. I don't ever hear a man saying, geez, you know, I wish I could find somebody to take care of me, or, you know, I wouldn't mind it if somebody just took care of me and I didn't have to work. So men don't have that option. Men don't have three options in the world. Men have one. What does that say to a young boy when he looks at his sister or his, you know, female friend here, and she's looking at the world and she's going, oh, well, you know, I guess I could go into the workforce, or I guess I could, you know, get married and stay home or whatever, or I guess I could, you know, have a child and be a homemaker. And the young boy's going, I don't seem to have those options. What does that mean about me? And if I do seek out one of those options, which is to be taken care of, to not work, then I'm seen as not being a man. You see the terrible bind in that, right? Here's another one. You know, so especially these days, like, I mean, it's always been, this has been a kind of a significant change, you know, because back in the 30s and 40s and 50s or whatever, it was traditional, I guess you could say, that a man married a woman who was younger than him, that a man sought out a partner, and a woman also sought out a partner who was a bit older than her. But probably somewhere in the 70s, in this thing that they call the sexual revolution, starting in the 60s and showing up, especially through feminism in the 70s, women began to pursue uh, men who were significantly younger than them. People would say, oh, well, you know, that's a woman who's celebrating her sexual liberation, and this is a sign of her empowerment. Where if a man were to pursue a younger woman, these days he's called a pervert. Like, that's a huge, huge, if you will, want to call it double standard. It's a gross distortion, you know, that we live in, where if a man is interested in a younger woman, he's a pervert. But if a woman is interested in a younger man, she's being empowered. She's living an empowered life. No, that's terrible. That's a terrible idea, terrible thought. Uh, psychologically speaking, it's always better for people to partner, if you will, within a couple years of your age for a lot of different reasons. Not that, you know, age gaps of 10 years and 15 years and 20 years can't work out, but those are just, I mean, those are really not the norm. You don't see that in nature. You don't see that, you know, just naturally happening. There's a lot of reasons why that's not a good fit physiologically and psychologically, even culturally. Um, just not a good fit. But you know, the message that it sends to a man that you're a pervert just because you show interest in someone a few years younger than yourself, that's a terrible idea. That's a terrible idea. um, and again, a little bit earlier, you know, again, along with this whole 70s movement, you know, is the idea that somehow women are in charge of defining what masculinity is supposed to look like, how men should speak, how men should emote, how men should behave. um, that's just terrible. That's a terrible idea. Um, you know, one of the interesting phenomena that we hear a lot about right now is, first of all, is fatherlessness in the home, and especially in the U.S., the United States, in the African American communities. How back in the 30s and 40s, you know, it's like 70%, 70+% of the, even 80% of the homes were two-parent intact families, and now it's almost opposite. Now 75% of those homes do not have a father. Now, some would point to government intervention back in the 60s or 70s that began to dismantle, or attempts to dismantle, the nuclear family, and it also incentivized um, women to keep men out of the family because they got more government subsidy if a man was not in the home. If a man was in the home, if there were two parents in the home, then the government would not provide um, social assistances, benefits, incentives, if you will. So it actually incentivized uh, the culture to not have a man in the home. A lot of studies say that it's a pretty well known fact these days that that's what occurred, because the statistics at this point don't lie. That what it means is that there's a tremendous amount of young men being raised by women. There's a tremendous amount of young men being told how to be more like women, how to act more like a woman, how to emote more like a woman, how to behave more like a woman. And if you don't fall into those categories, you're yelled at and screamed at and kind of you know, harassed back into submission. Um, now the you know, this is the idea. The idea has been all along is that if women had an opportunity to raise these boys and to raise them to be more like women, then that would decrease the levels of assault and domestic violence and you know, just aggressive behavior and criminal behavior and drug trafficking, and it would lower the how many people are going to prison, all this kind of stuff. Actually, it's been the opposite. It's kind of like this experimentation has been going on for over 30 years, right? That we've got it right there to look at, that there's been thousands, if not millions, of young men being raised by women, and the numbers of murders and assaults and domestic violence, if that weren't true, if it weren't true that those numbers are still going up, then if that weren't true, then we wouldn't be seeing today the amount of energy around the issue of domestic violence and assault and the murders that are going on, especially in the African American communities. The black on black crime rates are increasing. Um, so that, yeah, the research doesn't show that. But again, you know, this is about kicking the Rottweiler. This is about trying to force the Rottweiler to become something it is not meant to be. Um, it's that the training methods are way off. Um, and it's just has a terrible impact on the male psyche, the male soul, and how that shows up in how a man conducts himself within society. Um, you know, again, this whole devaluing men has permeated everything, but certainly I've been aware of it as a counselor. I used to work with couples who were going through divorce and child custody issues and domestic violence, and related to the court. And myself, like many other men, have also been through divorce proceedings and child custody proceedings. Yeah, and one thing, and this is well known, that the courts were very, very biased against men, biased towards women. Um, and part of what we see these days, is still, it's recognized, and people and the courts are trying to respond to it. And it's great that there's been some movement towards, but again, for years, since the 60s through the 70s and beyond, um, a man's rights, if you will, as validated by law, have seriously been diminished. You know, um, Parent alienation has been one of those issues that has been swept under the rug, and there are various groups that keep trying to bring it to the forefront, because, of course, parent alienation happens when couples divorce, and then you have uh, like primary custody or sole custody or what have you granted to the woman, or maybe the man has some visitation rights, but then she thwarts those visitation rights, and then uh, you know toxifies, if you will, the kids' minds to be uh, against their father, which alienates the father. And most of the times, this is the man who has been alienated. And in most of these, you got to understand, in most of these things that I've brought up, there are exceptions, but usually the rules are that this is more a masculine, a more man thing than it is women. Yes, certainly women also are alienated. And thank God for these groups that are out there, because these groups are not fighting on behalf of one gender or the other. This is parent alienation. And this should never happen to a child. This should never happen to a parent. And again, to the point, this should never happen to a father, that when he fathers a child, when he brings a child into this world, and half of that child resonates with him and half resonates with the woman, but for some reason his involvement with that child is seen as less valuable. Now, we all know, that developmentally, of course, a child needs to attach and bond to people, and that first figure is primarily going to be the mother if she's breastfeeding. Of course, mother can now express milk, and the father can participate in some of that early bonding. But even then, we know that developmentally, there's that close bond with the mother. But after, 3 or 4 months, and especially as that moves on to 9 months and a year, that child starts to separate from the mother, starts to explore the world, and that's where the father has his arms open and starts to embrace the child. Um, and and that's where his role becomes incredibly important from there on through life. And mom's role changes with that, but she's also important. But just to say that no parent should be alienated, and no parent's presence should be devalued or valued over the other parent. But that's what's been happening. Again, kicking the Rottweiler. What message do you think that sends to our young boys? What message do you think that it sends to our young girls, that fathers aren't important? But for our young boys to see from the very beginning of their own life that their father is excluded. In their own bodies, they have his genes, his genetic codes, and there's a part of them that resonate with that father, and he's not around. That's terrible. That he's being kept away. That's terrible. you know um, Situations, like when a woman gives birth to a child, or let me just back that up a little bit, that a woman, when pregnant, can choose to terminate that baby against the father's wishes. How is that? I mean, we could talk about the value of human life and these kinds of things, and that's important to talk about. But just at that gender level, you've got a father and a mother here. Both of those have contributed to creating the life of this baby. I mean, this is where we have to walk our talk. Either life is sacred and human life is the most valuable thing in the world and sacred, or not. And in this instance, you know both parents have contributed to the creation of something sacred, made in the image of God. And the man is can be dismissed of the entire conversation as to whether this child is going to be born or not. And then, you know the child can be born into the world, and maybe the parents aren't together. But then, being the bias towards the court, now the mother gets to decide how frequently the father gets to visit. Or let's say in a situation where a couple come together and they have sex, they conceive a child, the father doesn't know this. Well, you know, the mother then has the right to not inform a father when he has fathered the child. She has the option, if you will. That should not be an option. If a man has fathered the child and brought a child into the world, part of that accountability on behalf of that child, regardless of how the couple got along or whether they stayed together, whether it was a one night stand, that mother now has the obligation to engage the father. No one should have the right to keep their child away from them, you know, short of, again, child protection issues. But to be able to have that option as a woman, and as a man to be able to not be able to do anything about it by law. What message do you think that sends to our young boys when they watch that happen? Even if it's a young boy who's in the custody of his mother, and she doesn't tell his father that he's alive. How do you reconcile that as a young as a child, as a young boy? What does that say to you about your masculinity, about your value as a man, about your value as a father? It really minimizes it. It's a direct attack on a man's dignity. So these are just a few of of the things that I was just thinking about, just trying to connect the dots here. Like, what what is going on that we're seeing all this crime, all this murder, all these assaults since the 50s, 60s, 70s. You know, there's been an an idea or a set of ideas proposed about how to go after this problem, but they have not worked. In fact, they've probably stoked the fires more than anything. You know, from what I've just talked about, and these are just my observations and what I grew up with, the psychological impact, the impact to the soul of of men, is just been tremendous. But people don't want to talk about this. And of course, men don't want to talk about it all that much either. As counselors, we know how difficult it can be to get a men's group together, or for men to come to counseling. And that's unfortunate, I think. But certainly as a society, we have not done a good job at all of encouraging men to have a voice, to have a voice. You know, Again, we've yelled at the Rottweiler, we've yelled at the big dog, we've kicked the big dog, we've scolded the big dog, we've bombarded with the big dog with constant, messages about his lack of value, um, and and that we just tolerate the big dog's presence, um, and laugh at him, when he's, make him a buffoon. How can that not have an impact on the psyche of men? How can that not be some source of greatly repressed uh, power, if you will, and that would turn into anger, that would go sideways, that would be channeled towards some level of aggression or revenge or narcissism. And what I mean by that, just kind of a self-centeredness. I mean, hell, you know, if nobody cares about me, if I'm getting the crap kicked out of me on a daily basis just because I'm a man, well, guess what? I'm going to go out and get mine. I'm going to go out and do what I need to do in order to, so I get to make it all about me, you know. And if that means selling drugs, if that means doing robberies, if that means, taking what I want, then, that's all part of it. And I think that that's how this core of pain and sadness just starts showing up all over the place. But again, I would say to you, if this is an area of concern for you, again, violence and all this, all its different manifestations, and not just by men, but also by women, then we have to start looking deeper into this. When we have to start getting honest about the messages that are out there that are really counterproductive. Right now, there's some really toxic messages out there about, like, male privilege, white men privilege. Pretty much right now, everything is you know is basically saying, to be politically correct or woke or whatever, that if you're a man, you have no right to speak. If you're a man, if you're not, if especially if you're a Caucasian man, you're just canceled on so many different areas. you know However, if you're a black man right now, you're also canceled. If you're a gay man, you're also canceled. If you're, a transgender man, you're also canceled. So this whole idea of being canceled just because you're a man, that's a terrible, terrible message. That's a terrible message. I've got a son who's 27, who's grown up in all this crap. If you're raising a boy right now, if you're raising a son, you really want to be aware of these messages that are going on right now and really fight them back, right? I mean, look into your little boy's eyes and tell him that he's canceled, that there's nothing he can say, nothing he can do, because some faction of the world says that you mean nothing, absolutely nothing, because you're a male. That's the climate that we live in right now, folks. It's getting worse and worse, and it's spreading, to not just men who are being canceled. Now, if you're a white woman, you're canceled. If you're a heterosexual woman, you're canceled. If you're, a black woman and heterosexual, you're canceled. If you're, it's spreading like a disease, like a cancer. And, you know, it's time that folks stand up to make things right and to speak the truth. So, elephants in the living room, folks, that need to be talked about. Having some really boring conversations, if you will, that have gone on forever and ever and ever, about how to resolve this problem, but nothing's getting better. You know, um, and we really need to get back to what a good, strong moral foundation is, because that's really where it all starts. That's where it all starts. It used to be said in psychology, it's like when it came to child development, that pretty much your children's way of being, their character, was kind of set by the time they were 5 years of age. We don't hear much talk about that anymore, but I can tell you, it's pretty much true. When I'm working with families these days, and parents want their children to act better or to act with more integrity or whatever, and I constantly have to look back into how the child was raised. What's going on? Like, why is there where's the foundation? Where's the moral foundation? Where's the moral fabric? Because that all needs to be set up. That all needs to be in place when children are young. And so now, for instance, down south, when we look at the riots that are happening, the riots, the looting, the violence that are going on by some people seeking peace, supposedly seeking peace, seeking justice, and yet they're actually the greatest perpetrators of verbal, physical violence, of you know, of lawlessness, uh, and it's like, but where is the moral foundation? It's that moral foundation that we take with us when we go into the world, where you come up against something, you know, like whether you're going to knock down a fence or not out there as a protester, whether you're going to throw that rock or not, whether you're going to throw that bottle, that Molotov cocktail, whether you're going to, um, you know, smash your bike into that pedestrian's car, whether you're going to smash the window of that corner store and steal. It's like, it's in those moments where you need a moral foundation to inform you, hey, there's a line that you don't cross. You don't destroy property, you don't steal, you don't throw rocks, you don't throw Molotov cocktails, you don't become part of a mob. And there's the psychology around people, what people do when they think they're anonymous within a mob. So we're talking about violence, we're talking about male and females in that group being violent. What has gone wrong? Where's it gone sideways? How do you avoid being seduced into mob rule, into the mob mentality? That has everything to do with a moral foundation, a strong moral foundation. So that's what we need to get back to, as far as I'm concerned. So thank you for listening. I really hope that you'll give this some thought. But remember, like I said, don't kick the big dog, okay? Don't scold the big dog. Don't wag your finger at him constantly. Remember, this big dog is a good dog. He wants to serve. He wants to protect. He wants to be loyal. He wants to take care of you. He wants the good things for you. But if you beat him down verbally and physically and constantly, watch out. You know, you reap what you sow. Personal accountability, folks. Personal accountability, social accountability. Yeah, I know there's a lot of people want police to be accountable and other people to be accountable. No, this comes down to personal accountability. If this is what's showing up on the scoreboard, if this is the reality of the situation, do all you can to be personally accountable, and do it in your families. Like I said, look into the eyes of that little boy and that little girl, and see if you want them subjected to the messages that are going on these days. If you want them canceled just because of their gender or because of their skin color, right? So protect them. All right. I know we all want a better life and a better existence. So let's move forward wisely and with humility, but also confidently. All right. Take care. Thanks for listening.